Welcome to the deep dive. Our mission, well, it's pretty straightforward. You bring the sources, could be articles, research, maybe just your notes, and we plunge right in. We find the crucial insights, the surprising details, and just enough context so you get truly informed, but without getting totally lost. Think of us as your fast track. Today, we're diving into a really comprehensive global news summary. It covers the week of May 26th to the 30th, 2025. And this source, it gives us a real snapshot, like the planet's pulse during those 5 days. Our goal is to pull out the main developments and, importantly, see how it all connects.
Yeah, and the source, it sets the tone immediately. It talks about the week's inherent complexity and volatility. It highlights, ongoing geopolitical conflict, shifting power dynamics between major players, the accelerating climate crisis, and some really significant legal and humanitarian stuff. It's definitely a dense period.
It is. But the source gives us a bit of a roadmap, right? It even lists the top 10 news, just to give you a sense of the sheer scope. So we're going to navigate those headlines with you, pulling out the threads that seem most important from this particular week. Okay, so let's start with the geopolitical landscape, specifically conflicts and, well, the efforts to manage them. Top of the sources list is the Israel-Hamas conflict. This week seemed heavily focused on diplomatic moves. Hamas was reportedly looking over a U.S. proposed ceasefire deal. And there were also reports suggesting Israel had accepted some kind of temporary truce proposal.
But, and this is what the source makes painfully clear, there's this stark contrast between those top-level talks and the reality on the ground. It highlights the UN warning of widespread famine risk across Gaza. That's huge. And it notes the closure of Al-Auda Hospital, the last functioning one in the north after evacuation orders. And the language it uses to describe aid distribution is, well, it's chilling, chaotic, and accompanied by lethal gunfire, people just desperate for food facing, lethal violence.
God, that report sounds incredibly grim. And the source quotes UN officials directly.
Yeah, accusing Israel of implementing forced starvation. And they put the responsibility for getting aid in squarely on the international community.
Wow. And then there was that other detail. A 14-year-old killed and labeled a terrorist.
Exactly. And the sheer granularity of these details, like a specific hospital closing, the chaos around aid trucks, those direct accusations, it just starkly shows how fast the reality on the ground can completely undermine any potential agreement being discussed higher up. It really highlights the immense challenge, right? How do you translate political ideas into actual relief when things are that bad? Plus, the source even mentioned a reported plan by the Israeli Security Cabinet, something about indefinite control of over 70% of the Gaza Strip and moving civilians south. If that's accurate, it just makes the path to any kind of lasting resolution even more complicated. It really makes you wonder, doesn't it? How does this escalating crisis on the ground impact the trust, the practicality needed for any peace talks to actually work?
It feels like the goalposts are just constantly shifting. Okay, shifting focus a bit, the source also covers the Russia-Ukraine war. This week saw, well, more large-scale drone attacks. That's become a grim kind of regularity now. But there was one detail that jumped out as pretty intriguing. Russia reportedly accusing Serbia of supplying weapons to Ukraine, calling it a betrayal.
Yeah, that detail is significant because it hints at potential friction, maybe cracks, even within what Russia might see as its sphere of influence. The source also noted a UN statement about the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant. Russia hadn't immediately opened it up, apparently. It's just a reminder that the risk of a nuclear incident, however unlikely, it's still hanging there.
Right, and then a really notable strategic move from NATO this week. Germany announced its first permanent overseas troop deployment since World War II. 4,800 troops heading to Lithuania. That's reinforcing the eastern flank.
And this isn't just, sending troops somewhere temporarily. The source frames it as a stated strategic evolution for NATO. It's described as a shift from, reassurance to a more solid forward defense. It's a tangible long-term commitment, and it seems like a direct response to perceived Russian actions. It signals a pretty fundamental change in NATO's posture right there on its border.
But maybe one of the most, striking insights from the source this week is what it terms a key economic contradiction. Points out that Western income from Russian fossil fuels is reportedly 3 times the amount of aid being sent to Ukraine, essentially funding the war they're trying to stop.
Yeah, that detail is, well, it's stunning, isn't it? Despite all the sanctions, the significant aid packages, the way the global energy market works means Western nations are maybe unintentionally, maybe not, contributing more to Russia's war chest through buying energy than they're giving Ukraine to defend itself. The clear takeaway here is that geopolitical goals, like supporting Ukraine and punishing Russia, they can get deeply complicated, maybe even actively undermined by these economic dependencies and market realities. It really forces you to question how effective the current strategies are, and it highlights this incredibly difficult balance between energy security and achieving those geopolitical objectives.
That's a really powerful point, kind of buried in the data there. Okay, let's move from those specific conflicts to broader shifts. Global alliances. The source highlights two developments this week that, when you put them together, seem to suggest a pretty significant trend. First, China establishing the International Mediation Organization in Hong Kong, that was May 30th, and representatives from over 30 countries were there. Some interesting names too: Pakistan, Indonesia, Belarus, Cuba, even the UN sent someone.
Right. And China presented this as, putting UN Charter principles into practice, showing the wisdom of harmonious coexistence. But what's really notable is that this is a concrete step by China to create an alternative multilateral institution. It signals a clear ambition to build frameworks for global governance that operate, well, outside or maybe alongside the existing Western-dominated ones. It reinforces that move towards a more multipolar world.
And the source directly links this to another piece of news. The accusation from the U.S. and its allies that North Korea and Russia are flagrantly violating UN sanctions with military deals. It mentioned their security ministers met.
Exactly. So when you combine China building its own multilateral platform with what the U.S. and allies see as clear evidence of deepening military ties between North Korea and Russia, a picture starts to emerge. The source basically suggests these two things together indicate that a de facto anti-Western or alternative geopolitical bloc is consolidating. It's not just about, individual alliances popping up. It's about major non-Western powers creating stronger strategic partnerships and actually building the institutions to support a world order that's less reliant on or less influenced by the West, which really begs the question, how will the rise of these alternative international structures actually reshape global competition and cooperation going forward?
Yeah, it certainly feels like we're watching the foundations of something new being laid down. Okay, shifting to great power dynamics and their direct impact, the source dives into U.S. policy, starting with what it calls tariff turbulence. This week saw some rapid back and forth around former President Trump's tariffs.
Yeah, it was quite the roller coaster. The report started on May 29th saying U.S. courts had actually blocked many of Trump's tariffs, and this apparently caused Asian markets to rebound a bit. But then, literally the next day, May 30th, a U.S. appeals court temporarily reinstated them. Just like that.
Wow. And the source noted the White House was appealing that initial ruling. And the Trump administration reportedly had a plan B ready anyway to keep the tariffs in place somehow. The real-world consequence highlighted. Just confusion for retailers and fewer container shipments heading to U.S. ports.
This rapid legal whiplash, it perfectly illustrates how domestic political stuff and judicial processes within a major global power like the U.S. can create significant international economic instability. The courts playing such an active role overriding or restoring presidential policy, it just introduces this layer of unpredictability that directly messes with global trade flows, supply chains, and market confidence. It makes you ask, doesn't it? How much uncertainty does a major power's internal system of checks and balances inherently create for all its global trading partners?
It's a powerful reminder that domestic policy often isn't just domestic, is it? Okay, now let's look specifically at U.S.-China relations. The source shows things remain pretty tense on multiple fronts.
Yeah, definitely. The source noted former President Trump was still accusing China of violating trade deals. Separately, there was a report that the U.S. State Department ordered embassies to stop new student visa appointments and planned more social media screening for Chinese students. Beijing, predictably, condemned that as political and discriminatory.
And China wasn't shy about stating its own red lines either. It repeated its firm opposition to U.S. arms sales to Taiwan, calling it that insurmountable first red line in the relationship.
Right. And Beijing also hit back, criticizing the U.S.'s abuse of national security concepts and export controls, specifically pointing to reports that the U.S. halted engine sales to the Chinese aircraft maker Comac. So when you look at all these points together, the source reveals how the competition between the U.S. and China has really broadened out. It's not just about trade deficits anymore. It's spilling over into technology like those engine sales, export controls, into education, student visas, and of course, security, the Taiwan arms sales. And China's accusations, about the U.S. abusing national security, that highlights a potentially dangerous trend. Economic and social policies are increasingly being framed, being justified under the banner of national security. That makes compromise incredibly difficult because these issues become sort of non-negotiable national interests. This whole securitization of policy, it raises the stakes, increases the risk of miscalculation, and really threatens to fragment global economic and academic ties. The key question it leaves you with is, where's the actual line between a genuine national security threat and just using that label to escalate political or economic competition?
That's a distinction with potentially massive global implications. Okay, moving on to urgent global challenges. The source paints a pretty stark picture of the accelerating climate crisis. He does this through very tangible impacts reported just this week.
Yeah, it includes some dramatic visual evidence, like the report of a Swiss glacier collapsing, and it links that directly to the broader reality of glacial retreat happening worldwide. The source also noted an increase in reported once-in-a-century storms, which seem to be happening a lot more often than once a century now. And there was a worrying report predicting more heat waves, more fires, more record temperatures globally just over the next 5 years.
And the specific examples from the source really drive this home, don't they? A state of emergency declared in Manitoba, Canada, because of wildfires forcing evacuations. And that's a striking statistic. Half the world's population reportedly experiencing an extra month of extreme heat, specifically because of climate change.
But the source doesn't just stop at the weather effects. It also touches on environmental degradation, like using the term ecocide for what's happening in West Papua due to palm oil extraction, basically large-scale environmental destruction. And it notes a growing climate justice movement in Nigeria that's targeting oil polluters. These details, they point to a really crucial evolution in the whole climate conversation. It seems to be moving beyond just the environmental science and the economics. It's now encompassing justice, indigenous rights, and the really unequal burden of climate change on vulnerable populations. It suggests that effective climate action has to address historical injustices and power imbalances. You have to integrate the social and political dimensions with the environmental ones. It really makes you consider, is climate change fundamentally an environmental problem anymore, or is it really at its core a justice and equity issue that demands a much broader societal response?
That certainly changes how you might think about the solutions. And speaking of priorities, the source highlights a report that puts the cost of conflict into sharp relief against climate action. It mentions a joint report stating that soaring global military spending threatens global climate action.
Yes, and the detail cited from the Guardian newspaper is particularly eye-opening. Increased NATO military spending alone could reportedly add 200 million tons of carbon emissions every year. And the report apparently calculates that unchecked military emissions growth could cause something like $264 billion in climate damage annually. That's a staggering figure.
And the source notes the real-world consequence of this trade-off is already visible. You have developing nations explicitly calling to redirect military funds towards climate action, and leaders, like the UK Prime Minister, apparently linking foreign aid cuts directly to increases in defense spending.
This report, it just clearly reveals a critical zero-sum game, doesn't it? Investing more in traditional military security seems to directly undermine our ability to achieve global environmental stability. The quantitative data those emissions figures, the cost of climate damage, it makes the trade-off undeniable. Pursuing security mainly through bigger military budgets actively hinders our ability to address the, frankly, existential climate threat. It forces a fundamental reevaluation of what security even means in the 21st century, and whether our current spending priorities align at all with long-term global well-being. And that call from developing nations, it just highlights the immense opportunity cost this military spending represents for them, money that could be used for building resilience, for sustainable development. It really begs the question, given the tangible, accelerating impacts of the climate crisis that we see every day, are traditional military priorities truly providing security, or are they inadvertently contributing to a far greater global threat?
It's a profound challenge to our current ways of thinking. Okay, let's shift gears now to some economic and social undercurrents highlighted in the source this week.
Right. The source noted U.S. stock market volatility, tied back to those tariff rulings we talked about initially up, then losing ground. NVIDIA's stock kept climbing after their earnings report. But there was also some positive news from major emerging economies, like India's GDP growth forecast, better than expected, around 6.5% for 2024-25. That shows some strength. And Hong Kong got a positive credit rating, indicating some resilience there as a financial hub.
But in contrast, the source mentioned the Nigerian naira is expected to depreciate significantly in 2025. That highlights ongoing regional economic vulnerability. And on the financial crime front, the conviction and imprisonment of a former Goldman Sachs banker in that massive 1MDB fraud scheme was noted. It underscores these persistent efforts to tackle major financial misconduct.
Yeah, this whole economic snapshot, it reveals a real patchwork of global performance this week. Some areas showing strength, others clearly facing headwinds. And that contrast between Hong Kong's positive rating, which the source linked to its sound financial system and active markets, and the 1MDB conviction, it underscores a really critical point. Strong governance and the rule of law are just absolutely essential for global financial stability and for building investor confidence, particularly for emerging markets trying to attract foreign capital. A sound legal and ethical foundation, it isn't just nice to have, it seems fundamental to economic health. It makes you wonder just how significant a factor is confidence in a country's legal and governance systems when it comes to driving those crucial global investment decisions.
Trust really does seem to be the bedrock, doesn't it?
Hmm.
Okay, expanding our view on the human impact, the source highlights several humanitarian crises beyond just the headlines from Gaza. It paints a really grim picture of Haiti. Violence, hunger, displacement are rampant. And it explicitly states that critical funding shortages are making everything worse.
Yes, with humanitarian groups really struggling as gangs control more territory. The source also covered some devastating natural disasters this week, like floods in Nigeria killing over 111 people in one town and wiping out 12 family members in another region. Just awful.
And the tragic migration stories kept surfacing too. A boat capsizing near Spain's Canary Islands, resulting in 7 deaths, and 11 Sudanese migrants killed in a car crash in the Libyan desert.
These crises, Haiti, Nigeria, the migration tragedies, they starkly reveal the interconnected drivers behind humanitarian emergencies. You've got political instability, violence, natural disasters, often amplified by climate change, economic hardship. They all lead to displacement and pose immense challenges for aid efforts. And that explicit mention of Haiti's critical funding shortages is particularly telling. It suggests possibly some aid fatigue or maybe resources just being diverted elsewhere, leaving some really vulnerable populations dangerously underserved. It implies a need for a more consistent, maybe more equitable global commitment to humanitarian aid. Moving beyond just reacting when a crisis hits the headlines and ensuring support for all populations in need, regardless of, geopolitical focus or media attention. It raises a tough question. Are global aid resources being allocated based purely on the severity of human need, or are they influenced more by geopolitical interests, media coverage, or maybe just donor priorities?
Another critical look at global priorities there. Okay, finally, let's touch on some key legal and political developments from the source, particularly some high-profile cases involving accountability. Former Sinn Féin leader Gerry Adams won a libel case against the BBC this week, awarded £100,000 over allegations he sanctioned a killing.
Right, and the BBC's reaction was quite pointed. They stated the ruling would hinder free speech, which raises these important ongoing questions about press freedom. This case really highlights that delicate balance, doesn't it, between the public's right to scrutinize public figures, especially about historical allegations, and an individual's right to protect their reputation. It could potentially influence how media outlets handle reporting on controversial or historical stuff going forward, maybe lead to increased caution in investigative journalism. It makes you ask, where's that appropriate boundary between holding public figures accountable for past actions and protecting them from potentially damaging, maybe unproven allegations?
It's definitely a complex tightrope walk. The source also noted other high-profile cases making news this week. Comedian Russell Brand pleaded not guilty to rape and sexual assault charges in London, and Sean Diddy Combs' federal sex trafficking trial was reportedly ongoing.
And in Argentina, the trial related to Diego Maradona's death was declared void, which just highlights the often lengthy and complex nature of these major legal proceedings, especially when they involve really prominent figures. But what seems notable when you look at these cases together, Adams, Brand, Combs, even that 1MDB banker we mentioned earlier, is what seems like a growing trend reported globally. High-profile individuals are increasingly facing serious legal scrutiny, regardless of their fame or influence.
Yeah, it definitely feels like there's been a shift in the landscape of accountability somehow.
Exactly. These cases, which get widely reported, they suggest that maybe fame and wealth are less of a shield against allegations of misconduct than they perhaps once were, especially in an era with so much increased public focus on issues like sexual assault and financial crime. It seems to indicate changing public and legal expectations for ethical behavior across different sectors, and that impacts everything from media reporting reporting to corporate culture, public trust. The key question here becomes, how much have these shifts in public awareness, social movements, evolving legal interpretations, how much have they fundamentally altered the landscape of accountability for powerful and prominent individuals?
It feels like the standards are definitely changing. Okay, so zooming back out after this deep dive into the source material, what are the big takeaways from this pretty intense week in late May 2025?
Well, we saw that long-standing conflicts, like in Gaza, remain deeply entrenched. The reality on the ground often seems to override diplomatic efforts, doesn't it? We saw clear signs of escalating major power competition, U.S.-China, China's initiatives, Russia-North Korea ties, and maybe the formation of alternative blocs. And we saw undeniable accelerating impacts of climate change that really demand a hard look at our global priorities, especially around spending.
And we saw how all these factors intertwine with economic volatility, these persistent humanitarian crises, and also these evolving standards of legal accountability for prominent figures. It really paints a picture of a world that is, well, deeply interconnected, certainly volatile, and constantly adapting or trying to adapt.
Absolutely. And making sense of these dynamics, trying to connect the dots, it's crucial for understanding the world you live in. And the source's overarching implication, it really resonates, I think, given the increasing fragmentation of global alliances that we observed and those accelerating, very tangible impacts of climate change. Are the international systems and priorities that were largely built for the 20th century still adequate? Are they still fit for purpose to address the complex, overlapping challenges we're facing right here in the mid-21st century? It's definitely a question worth carrying with you.
A powerful thought to leave you with. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We'll be back soon with more insights pulled directly from the sources you share.